Okay, let's continue on as we consider enacting the prophetic, looking at liturgical plurality and what that means for designing multicultural worship and meaningful cultural approaches to prayer. Remember, we've been talking about the theme of Psalm 67 about may the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples with equity and guide the nations of the earth. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. From Psalm 67, 4-5. Now, I want to give you some helps working through this. How do we begin? And in your appendix in Pharadien, in the Pharadien book on Christian worship worldwide, the appendix has a very important article called The Nairobi Statement of Worship and Culture. It was produced by the Lutheran World Federation in 1996. They had a lot of foresight for dealing with global worship, and it gives us 4 incredibly helpful principles to guide us no matter where we're at and how we are approaching this, because the whole world is global. Not only do we go overseas outside of the States, but the peoples are here among us. They've been here for a long time, and new people groups are coming all the time. So we need to rethink this and work through it. And so look up and read. I've assigned it as part of your reading, the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture. And they look at culture in terms of 4 major principles. Worship that is transcultural, worship that is contextual, worship that is countercultural, and worship that is cross-cultural, my particular area of specialty. Of course, all of this is applicable. And then what kind of challenge do we have for the churches today? We need to move forward with humility. We need to recognize the danger of overconfidence and manipulating worship. And we need to realize the danger of universalizing and expecting people to just get it. So let's look at more of each of these 4 aspects individually. First, when worship is transcultural, I can't say the word. Transcultural means that it creates this umbrella where no matter what, everybody needs to know Jesus. Everybody needs to know that we need to come and worship God and to give him our praise. They define it this way. They talk about worship as this transcultural worship as the same substance for everyone, everywhere, beyond culture. Now, the biblical scriptures are most often, and they are indeed, our starting point and relationship with God. I'm going to go through these briefly. I want you to read the article to go deeper into each of these aspects. Okay, so worship aspects that are found, practices that are found in almost every church worldwide, are actions such as prayer, gathering, singing, the Lord's Supper, we've talked about that. Scriptures are read, and there's baptisms. How they are approached differs. So that's why we need to recognize that and see that worship is as well contextual. That means it varies according to the local situation. Both nature and culture differs. There are palm trees on the coast of Kenya that we don't have on the coast up in Maine on the east coast of the United States. There are differences in the use of the body, the way people move, the verbal participation. There's a hierarchy, how long the services are. In Africa, I've sat through many 4 to 5 hour services on a wooden bench. Oh my goodness, that was hard for me. Clothing differs, and the requirements differ for how we dress to show respect to God and enter into worship. Then there's also worship as countercultural. That's where there's a challenge to the culture in that what is contrary to the gospel in any given culture. This is using the word sin, which we don't often talk about, but is a reality in our faith traditions and in what God is talking about. He bridges that sin gap for us, and that will differ And each culture has its ways of going against Christ. And that's when we need to be countercultural. Often we can bring an outside practice and think it's perfectly safe, but when it gets transported into a new locality, it's misunderstood and it's not communicated well, and often it leads people to what we call syncretism. There is worship as cross-cultural. It makes possible sharing between different local cultures. And what we need to do is make room for one another. We need to affirm each other in a larger vision of who God is. When we move cross-cultural, like we're doing in our Kesha, we're learning that there's so much more that can be done for engaging with God, and this helps us to understand on a deeper level. There's so much to this, and I get so excited. I have to be careful. Okay, now, when things are shared cross-culturally, we need to be aware of the significance of each of these four principles, not only cross-culturally, but transculturally, contextually, and cross-culturally. And the importance here is that because there's significant issues to be dealt with in terms of a people's identity. I write about this in my new book that I just submitted the manuscript to Baker for, Global Arts and Christian Witness, and how it leads back to worship. So I'll be sharing more about that later. We want to avoid a foreignness of the gospel, a foreignness of who this Jesus is. We want to move away from nominalism of the gospel. What happens often is that people say, well, it doesn't really speak to me, and I want to know Jesus, but it's not helping me very much. So we're not able to live out what we believe. And we want whatever we do to help form God-oriented lives. And so that brings us to Revelation 21 that talks about the glory and the honor of the nations will be brought into the holy city of God. That is, eschatologically, we're looking for that day when all nations will come and worship before him. In this place of perfect worship and the immediate experience of God's presence, the culturally particular gifts of nations find a natural home. Attending choir rehearsals in the holy city promises to be an unequaled, multicultural music feast. And we want to consider some of those briefly. Liturgical plurality is what we're considering here, and a precedent for overcoming cultural uniformity. There's no one way to worship, but there is only one God whom we do worship, and that's our focus. So that allows us to draw from our culture. Now, there's an important concept here called enculturation, and that is the ongoing dialogue between faith and cultures, according to Aylward Shorter, a Catholic missiologist. And in Phaedian, we read that it is the creative and dynamic relationship between the Christian message and a culture or cultures. That's what enculturation is about. And so there's a need for more diversity in style, especially in the area of the arts. And we need to be intentional about it and consider different aspects of it. We hear and we read according to Michael Hahn, that virtually every metropolitan area of the United States is becoming a microcosm of the world's diversity. Cultural diversity is at our doorstep, and is liturgical plurality a way to bring new vitality to our worship? He asks, and I think absolutely. Yes, it's something that we need to consider and to engage. And so we're going to look more in particular at liturgical plurality for the 21st century. What's a model for cross-cultural worship rather than uniformity or eclecticism? We have 3 assertions of what it is not and 3 assertions of what it is. Let's look briefly at this. So first of all, liturgical plurality is not ethnotourism. Oh, that is interesting. Isn't that something? Well, I enjoyed that. Congregations should not be allowed to think that showing solidarity with others by singing global hymns is the same as, quote, having fun in the sun in Mexico. I say music is attached to people. When we critique a particular style of music, we are criticizing the people themselves. Embodied and embedded in culture is significant for building a people's identity. Liturgical plurality is not denying one's cultural heritage of faith in song, prayer, and ritual. It is a conscious effort to lay one's cultural heritage and perspective alongside another's, critique each, and learn from the experience, and grow in relationship with God and with one another. Finally, then, liturgical plurality does not necessarily imply a synthesis of styles into one universal form. To the contrary, it is an acknowledgement of and participation in a diversity of voices within a liturgical structure. In other words, we recognize one another and we embrace all that God has made each group of people to be. We embrace who we are and we embrace our brothers and sisters in the Lord, no matter from where they come. So let's look. Again, liturgical plurality is then a countercultural expression of faith that breaks out of boxes. Liturgical plurality celebrates the incarnation as a cross-cultural manifestation of God among us, all of us. Participating in the incarnational experience of others must be different than ourselves. It enables us to place in perspective our localized view of the other who became one of us. And we can say, yes, we are brothers and sisters in the Lord, and we join together in worship. That's awesome. It also raises our awareness of consciousness of those who have been invisible to us, listening to, learning from, and sharing in their prayers, and joining with them in common intercessory prayer for the world. The voice of the voiceless becomes heard in our worship in the realization of liturgical plurality. In short, liturgical plurality is making room at Christ's table for all those who have been formed in God's image. And that's a wonderful theological foundation. I pray that we can follow through on this. So we're going to look at a number of examples of plurality, a number of examples of how this works itself out in terms of cultural embeddedness and being cross-cultural and how we can still relate with one another. I've put this together. This is a song we're learning. Hakuna Mungu Kamawewe. Hakuna Mungu Kamawewe. And I'm going to show you 4 different versions of it. And eventually, I'll make them available to you separately as videos in the course for you to look at as well and just really listen to on a longer basis than what I should be doing and forcing you to in this lecture video. But here's a few samples. I'll give just a few comments. We're going, first of all, to Kenya. That's where I first heard this song, and it's a very popular one even today. Notice the movement and the joy. There's real celebration. Now, here's at a seminary, a workshop in Tanzania, and also a Kiswahili-speaking country, at an SIL, a linguistic workshop, and listen to the translators and how they perform it. Lots of clapping. Notice the moving and the moving out into the center. Oh, I love it. And it goes on and on. There's always a lead singer who carries the main content, and there's a response. This helps in oral situations. Okay, there we go. Now, here's a group of Americans who are traveling to Africa. I believe this is in South Africa. And they are singing it to make friends and to participate with the local congregation. This is a men's group from the States. Notice they don't know how to clap, but they've got the drum. They're moving, they're dancing. That's important for African worship. Okay, let's move on. And we'll go now to Urbana, the great mission conference sponsored by InterVarsity. And this song made its way onto the platform. And again, it's adapted. You have the basic song, you have a difference in lighting, you have a difference in engagement. All the same, it is recognizing a people and the joy that there's no one like our God. If I can start it here. Oops. Well, I will make that available for you online. Let's close up here and talk about what it takes for designing multicultural worship. In your local ministry, think about your own context. I want you to identify 3 things that you want to apply to designing multicultural worship that you've experienced during this week's readings and the lecture videos. And I would encourage you to begin with looking at how many different people groups, language groups live in your area, and how many different people groups, language groups come and worship at your church, and what you are doing, how we are doing in welcoming everyone. Also, think about the theology and the concepts that are at hand there, and how really this approach to liturgical plurality is very biblical and very theological and important for people connecting with God. And then consider practical applications about how you will go about doing that. And you can do that, you can begin as you work through and plan your Kesha for your context, learning from Kenya on how to have a long prayer meeting that brings celebration and intercession together. Thank you. Here's a closing benediction. I will say the grace, and everyone responds by saying, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all, now and forevermore. May the Lord bless you.